Our guests on the Motivation Show today are Rhonda Lauritzen, a professional biographer and author of A Child in Berlin, the poignant story of Heidi Posnien and her mother during the fall of Germany. Our other guest is Heidi Posnien herself. Welcome, ladies, to the Motivation Show.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so very much.
So I've been reading this incredible book. Unfortunately, I haven't gotten through the entire book yet, but I will. I've read about 100 pages, and it's a page turner, all right. That's why it's like, oh my God, I got to get to every single page here. The story just gets juicier and juicier. And love for you to maybe just share an overview of A Child in Berlin for our listeners.
So, this is Heidi, and she was a child in Berlin. She moved to Berlin at the age of 3, the very month that Hitler invaded Poland. And she and her mother were ethnically Polish. They grew up on the border of Poland and Germany. And the story takes place from 1939 to 1949. So Heidi is in the middle of everything, and there as Berlin falls.
Well, of course, 1939 was the invasion of Poland, and changed, of course, history, and I can't even imagine what it was like to be in the actual capital city itself, right in the heart of it all. And so, the I guess the story sort of the question begs, and I think anybody would be thinking about this. It's like, how much did you know and when about what was really happening and what Hitler's plans really were?
I'll take a first stab at that, and then if Heidi wants to add any more. One of the things that at the end of the war, people were saying, oh, we didn't know, we didn't know.
Naturally,
And there were others who said, oh, what rubbish. And one of the
right?
things that came out was they knew enough to know, they didn't want to know.
Hmm.
And Heidi's mother, though, was, Berlin was the least Nazified part of all of Germany. Only, I think, about 30%, don't quote me on that number, but it was something like that, voted for Hitler. And so Heidi's mother was an opera singer, and she was ethnically Polish, and she had Jewish friends. So she saw far more than most, and her eyes were much more open than most, much earlier. So she certainly was in it and living it as it happened. You want to add anything to that?
Well, she was very strict about me when she asked me questions, not to give anything away. I always had to say, I don't know. I don't know. If somebody asked me, what's your name? I had to say, I don't know. And what's your birthday? I don't know. So that's,
There was one point when you told your mother, I don't want to say I don't know, people will think I'm dumb.
yeah.
And what did you tell your mother at that?
Yeah.
Something like your mother said, it's better to be dumb than in trouble or dead
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, to me, the one of the most remarkable stories, not only in your book, but probably any other book I've ever read, is to know that Heidi's mom, 𝐂𝐞𝐢𝐲, right? That's how it's pronounced.
Yeah.
Actually was a opera singer. Of course, that was something that Hitler was very much in favor of, and we understand that 𝐂𝐞𝐲 had a boyfriend, Werner, right? And they were invited to dinner where Hitler was the head of the table. That's quite an extraordinary story to actually, the fact that your mom actually had dinner in the same premise as Hitler. Tell us about that story.
Well, it was at the Reichstag, and she actually felt flattered.
She was
So,
young and beautiful and up
Yeah.
and coming, kind
Yeah.
of in the middle of everything. Life was
Yeah.
coming up roses for her. And that was early in the war before things started to get bad. And then shortly after that, 𝐂𝐞𝐲 started to understand that her place in the opera was made available because they had kicked the Jewish opera singers out. And she started to see her friends being displaced and terrible things happening. And that was when she had to make a terrible choice.
Yeah. Well, at first she was flattered because she thought, well, but then she realized that's not the direction that she wanted to go. So,
Heidi, you remember your mother and her friends making fun of Adolf Hitler behind closed doors?
yeah.
but they're not something you would do publicly.
Yeah, you didn't dare. But with your best friends, you could always make fun of him.
And you mentioned a terrible choice. What was that terrible choice?
She had to leave. She couldn't stay in Nazi society. She couldn't stay and date this Wehrmacht officer and be involved in that. And she had to decide, do I help others? Do I help my Jewish friends and other friends in the building, or do I turn a blind eye? And she decided to leave the opera and began engaging in black market. She had to support Heidi and the family, and so everybody was kind of dealing at some point in the black market, but she became very involved in black market goods, and whether it was fabric or food or helping people.
Well,
How,
they called it underground. She went underground.
yeah, how dangerous was that, and how much did she know the danger at the time?
Certainly the danger was well understood. People would get hauled in for all kinds of things. Even early in the book, she was hauled in for a couple of days and interrogated. Uh, and so it was very dangerous. But everybody at that point was engaging in some black market activity. You simply could not get enough to eat on the open market with your ration cards. They were mostly theoretical in that the calories were there on your card, but if you stood in line, you couldn't get what you needed.
Well, you mentioned that Berlin, and you mentioned in your book, perhaps only about 30% of people actually were voted for Hitler. Of those 30%, I mean, how many, you feel that most of them felt just there wasn't any other choice but to just go along with the program? I mean, sounds to me like 𝐂𝐤𝐡𝐢 was among the very few that rebelled.
Right. I mean, clearly, especially early in the war, there was so much almost the cult of Hitler. He was this rock star figure. If you look at early in the story, we have the 50th birthday parade, this spectacle when everyone was turning out and thousands of people and throwing themselves at Hitler. So early in the war, there were many who supported. And then by the end of the war, people were very disillusioned. But 𝐂𝐤𝐡𝐢 was one of the early ones to make a choice.
Well, you mentioned Goebbels in the book, who, of course, was the propaganda minister. And you mentioned Magda Goebbels, who was his wife. And she was kind of like Hitler's right arm at that actual dinner party. I mean, were there people really in Berlin that sort of taken really by the propaganda? Was he that good, or were the people just that naive, or was it a combination? I mean, what was it? Because it's hard to look back and say, really, were there people that taken by his propaganda?
Because he was making all these promises.
Mm.
See, they had what is it called when you didn't get any food? You had the same thing here in America.
The rationing.
Well, no, there's a word for it. That everybody went through, the whole world went through that. And Hitler made all these promises.
Oh, the Depression.
Depression.
The Depression after World War I.
Yeah. He promised, everybody's going to have chicken in every pot and things are going to be better. And so, yeah, they believed it.
Mm.
And Eli, oh, go ahead.
People didn't have jobs. And so, yeah, he made all these promises. And that's why they adored him. That's why they.
And for a while, everything looked great.
Yeah.
Things were economically, they were doing well. At that parade, you could see the might of Germany on display.
Yeah.
But Eli, there's something else to touch on with regard to what they knew. Something that will always stick with me that I learned in the research, and that is today people are calling it an imagination gap because rumors were everywhere. I mean, Berlin was rumor all the time, and the rumors started to come about the concentration camps and what was happening when people were being displaced to the east. And so people were hearing, but they couldn't believe it. And today it's called an imagination gap because it was easier to believe that it was enemy propaganda than to believe that their own country was capable of such terrible, terrible things.
Yeah.
And to me, that is just chilling and something for us to remember for our day.
Yeah.
Yeah, because you think about America today and how people voice themselves on social media and have an opinion about everything to kind of chilling and sometimes stunning to believe that
Mhm.
people did not grasp the reality of the situation and just didn't want to, maybe, or whatever it was. But I guess it's a different era, a different time, and propaganda can certainly play with people's minds. And also, a lot of the propaganda you talk about in your book was about the actual, the myth of the fact that Berlin would be protected because they had the proper defenses, the anti-missile defenses or whatever that was, and then slowly but surely, Britain started to bomb Berlin, and those promises unfortunately started to melt away. Tell us a little bit about that.
Berlin was probably the best defended city in Europe from the air. At first, it was, of course, the bombs could never even make it to Berlin, and when they did, that was the first moment that people really started to become disillusioned. Like, okay, we're not being told everything. And as the bombings became worse and worse, but the bunkers were excellent. People would go into these giant bunkers that were many lives were saved because of those bunkers. So in that regard, the defenses were strong. But by the end, it was a virtually undefended city. When Berlin fell, they never thought that ground troops would ever possibly make it to Berlin. And so when the Russians came in, it was a city of women and children with no evacuation plan and virtually undefended.
Yeah, growing up in the book, I felt like I grew up with Heidi,
Mhm.
and she always questioned where's her father, and her mother seemed not to want to really talk much about her father until one day, when they got the bad news that Alfred, her father, right, passed away. Um, and Heidi gets that news. And she always had this dream that somehow her father would reappear. Tell us about that, Heidi.
That was actually just a small part because he was killed in the war, and I don't remember my father. So there were things that were much more memorable.
Your mother would say, "Oh, if your father were here, I would send you to him." And what would you say?
Yeah,
If my father were here, I would go."
I'd go. Yeah, yeah,
But yeah, your father was never around.
yeah. I don't even remember him. In fact, her boyfriends were the ones I always called daddy because I didn't remember my father.
Eli, one note that, as we think about the cost of war, and this is a story about women and children, civilians on the ground. But something hit me the other day. Germany lost an entire generation of men and boys, just gone. You think about who paid the price. So many of those men were conscripted. They didn't want to fight, but they had to. Just gone.
And fight for what when you look back at it, right? Like
Oh,
Right, right.
to like be the only country left in the world.
oh, yeah, the senselessness of it.
Yeah, that's the sad part when you look back at that for sure. So it's next year, 80 years since the end of World War.
Right.
It's you've touched upon a lot of things. What do you feel, Rhonda, makes your book unique among the hundreds or thousands of books written about World War II and Hitler and all that?
Right. There are many stories, and you've covered some gripping Holocaust stories, and those are so very important. But because Berlin or because Germany started the war, for a long time, you didn't hear very much of what it was like for the German people, for the civilians. And today, still, what it was like in Berlin is a story that's very rarely been told, especially right at the end, because so many people were evacuated by then or bombed out. This is a very unique perspective where you have this juxtaposition of the capital, the Nazi capital. At the same time, you have this civilian population, many of whom were not supportive. So, very interesting on the ground eyewitness story as it fell.
Well, what's interesting is how Heidi was so young at the time that this all happened, particularly when Poland got invaded in 1939. She's 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years old. How did she remember all this?
You always remember things that are awful or something that is really wonderful. If your life
Mm,
is just monotone, you don't remember anything.
good point. Yeah, it's either the highest of the high or the lowest of the lows, and the stuff
That's
that's in between are forgotten.
yeah.
When we did her, for years we met and she gave me oral history, and the detail that she could recall about the war, it was like entire years were packed into those final weeks. Just incredible eyewitness detail that her memory was absolutely resplendent.
Heidi, what I'd like to ask is, when you look back on it now, how do you feel about your childhood and the war years?
I just lost my earpiece.
Yeah, Heidi, how do you feel about the war years now in your childhood looking back?
Oh, I still have uh, flashbacks when I'm driving past a garbage dump or someplace like that. The odor, it reminds me of the war, the city burning and people dying and dead bodies.
Let me
And
talk.
how do you maintain the positivity and the bright outlook despite that?
Well, even when I was little, it helped me a lot that my mother would keep her cool. And however she reacted, that's how I reacted. And as long as she was being cool about it, then I thought everything was okay. And this is how I keep doing it until to this day.
If your mother's world was good, your world was good.
Yeah, yeah,
Hmm. Your mother was a smart lady.
she was. She
She
really was.
understood that.
Yeah.
Um, so how closely did you and Heidi work on this story, Rhonda? Could you tell us a little bit about the process, what that was like?
Yes, first of all, such a joy. I can't begin to tell you how changed I am because I have Heidi in my life now. And
How'd you
she,
find each other?
we were introduced by a mutual friend. I had
Hmm.
worked on another biography, and she said, I think you should meet Heidi.
Hmm.
And I felt woefully unqualified to do a World War II story. But we got into it, and I just felt this story had to be told, and spent 5 years completely immersed in the history. And so Heidi would tell me the stories, and she gave such rich details of the food and the type of radio they had in the home, and the mischief that she and her friends would get into, and what the bombings were like. And so she would tell me these scenes, and then I would go home and write it up and put it in historical context, because one of the things she didn't have was necessarily the timeline. She
Yeah.
remembered the details, but didn't have, children don't remember like how long something
Yeah,
takes.
sequences. Yeah.
Yeah, sequences. So I had to fill in some of those and some of the historical context. But I would read it to her. And do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, then we ended up both crying and being upset and having flashbacks. And yeah, brought a lot of tears to our eyes, but sometimes we laughed a lot over it too, because of some of the tricks and games that we've played as kids.
Tell about when you would read it, how it would bring you right back to. I'm putting her on the spot, but you would sometimes say, I'm reading it and I'm feeling like I'm right there again.
Yeah,
And that was how I knew we got it right.
yeah,
So she would correct details, but if she would read it and be in tears, then I would know we were in the ballpark.
yeah, yeah, because all of
And
a sudden I was reliving it.
yeah.
Mm.
So, Rhonda, were there any sort of remarkable things that stand out in terms of the stories that were related to you that kind of like shocked you or really, sort of will stay with you forever? Anything in particular?
I How do I begin? First of all, I want to say that seeing Heidi before me and before you here gives me hope. There were so many awful things that she saw with her eyes that no child should ever have to experience. One thing at the end, and we say this on the back cover, so it's not a spoiler, but she ends up living alone in a bombed out apartment at the age of 9, completely alone as the final weeks of the war unfold. I mean, can you even imagine at 9 years old fending for yourself in a war? It almost defies imagination. And yet, when we read a story, we can imagine. And that's how we remember, right? Is through immersing ourselves in the story. And so the story wrings it out of you because there are so many hard things. But then we see Heidi today, full of light and she's funny and she's wise and she's warm. And that ultimately is why it's a hopeful story.
And in the book, we talk about 𝐂𝐤𝐡𝐢𝐲 sister. We talk about Heidi's grandmother.
Yeah.
And we talk about some people who were there, to take care of her. How did she end up alone?
That's a spoiler.
Yep.
We're gonna, her mother had to make some choices and consequences, but you'll
Yep.
just have to get
We'll
that to
we'll we'll leave that for the teaser, so that people pick up the book. That's for sure. Yeah.
But one note about the relatives is that they end up in Poland, and that's part of behind the Russian wall. And so her family, families were torn apart after Russia put that wall up. So that's one of she has such affection and love and remembrance of her Oma, but that was a place where she could never return to.
I never got to see her anymore.
Mm. So, Rhonda, you are inspiring, I think, a lot of people with this book. And a lot of people might want to write their own life stories, to record their own family histories. What advice do you have for them to get started?
The first thing is do it now, and it will be enough.
Mm.
Don't wait. I can't tell you how many people have emailed me and said either they did it and they were so glad they did, or they didn't and they regretted it.
Don't wait to be perfect. Just do it.
Just do it. We
Yep.
have apps on our phones. It's not hard to pick up a microphone and just pull out a recorder. If someone starts telling starts telling stories, just capture their voice. To me, the voice is intimate and it's personal, and that's the easiest and most rewarding way. You don't have to write a full book.
Yeah, yeah. I'm a firm believer that I think people get stuck in the idea of this got to be perfect, and nothing is perfect. So you might as well start and see where it goes. And yeah, this incredible quote, you like to say that when you tell your story, it changes the ending. What exactly do you mean by that?
I mean that our stories will change our families forever. When we read a story like Heidi's, it becomes part of us. We can feel it vicariously, and we will always remember. I promise the readers will not forget this story. And it changes us. It changes our perspective. And it will change you in ways you don't see coming. Heidi's story and meeting her has forever changed me. Our relationship and our friendship today, I'm a different person
Yep.
because you came into my life.
Yeah.
So you never know the ripple effect. And when you're writing your own story, you personally will process and change and look at your life differently because you worked on your own story. It is freaky magic.
Yeah, and Heidi, I'd like to ask you, growing up the way you did in those circumstances, what life lessons do you think you've taken away from that? What could you teach other people, from all this experience?
Just that I've gotten stronger, that no matter what happens to me since then, when I've lost my children with illnesses, I've always taken care of people, and yeah, just be giving and loving and take life the way it is. Yeah.
Fascinating you should say that because I just posted something in one of my Facebook groups called NYC Happenings, and
Yeah.
I posted a quote, and it
Yeah.
basically talks about, the best life lived is a life that you live to serve other people.
Yeah.
And
I,
if you get out of yourself, you'll be a happier person.
right. I said, I've always felt like eat life, don't let life eat you. So just
Oh my God, that is like going to be my next favorite quote. Do you mind if I post that in my
go
Facebook
ahead.
group?
Go ahead. Yeah.
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 And it's so true because, the way I look at life is that, there's probably 100 things a week that happen to you, right?
Hmm.
And it can either eat you up
Right. Right.
or it's a choice at the end of the day. It's not really what happens to you, right? It's a choice of how you let it eat you or not eat you up.
Yeah. I don't believe in wallowing in self-pity. You just go ahead with life and live life to the best you can. And the more you do for other people, the less you worry about yourself.
Oh my God, that is what a great lesson. Yeah, if you can the best way to get out of your depression or your
Yeah.
downtime is just go ahead and do something nice for somebody else, volunteer at a soup kitchen or whatever nice deed you have, it really does feel well. And that's just a tremendous lesson for sure. So, one of the questions I wanted to ask upon, we did talk about, the obvious, which is, the mistreatment of the abuse, or probably understating the words of the Jewish people during that time. Can you expound upon that a little bit more? Maybe Heidi can talk a little bit about her experience with that.
Did you catch the question?
No.
We're connected here.
Ah.
So he asked, what about the mistreatment or the terrible things that happened to the Jewish people? And I might add other people. There were others who were persecuted, the Romanis, the people with disabilities in your building.
Oh, yeah.
LGBTQ as well, right?
Absolutely, yes.
All those people, gypsies, they're all mistreated. So
Yeah. Well, my mother had a girlfriend, and her son, he was handicapped or whatever you call it. And when she took him to the hospital, they killed him.
A little boy, this, smiling, loving little boy went to the hospital and didn't come home because they killed him in the hospital. I mean, how chilling. Can you even imagine?
Yeah, that was horrible.
So we are at closing time.
Okay.
We've had a great story here. We can go on for days. What are the important takeaways from a child in Berlin for our day?
Can you say that?
Sure. Well, the first thing is that it's not my job to tell the reader what it means. If I'm too heavy-handed, then that's just propaganda. When people read it, I would urge people to reflect, to think about, the deniers and those that say it didn't happen, or the things that we don't want to see or believe in our own day. I believe that evil will always be among us. And when we become complacent is probably when we're most vulnerable. So this is as timely today as it was then.
Yeah, believe that.
Well, what I left with the 100 pages that I read feeling was I got to know a lot about Heidi as a little girl, and a pretty happy little girl, who just went about her way and, enjoyed some of the small things, whether it's a piece of bread or whatever the occasion was, playing with some of the neighbors and the friends. And despite all the madness around her, she was able to have a relatively normal childhood, obviously being by herself in the end of the war. That wasn't so normal. But before that, it seemed like she had a relatively happy, childhood. And again, we mentioned a lot of that has to do with her mom, 𝐂𝐤𝐿, who instilled those values in her. So anything else you'd like to add before we depart?
That's one of the most hopeful things for me that you picked up on, Eli, is the resilience of children. When I get depressed about the future, I just think about Heidi and think children will always be resilient. And even in dark times, they can come out of it with their light intact. They know how to make play and fun. And so that gives me a lot of hope for the future.
I agree.
And, for those who are listening, they won't be able to see this image here, but we have the book up for those that are watching us on YouTube. And I do have one last question. Tell us about the cover itself and how you chose this image and why.
Well, that's Heidi. That's Heidi right there.
Yeah.
And so
Happy child.
happy child. I mean, she's a skinny little thing. She was always hungry, as children were during
And she
the
hasn't
war.
changed a bit.
Still smiling.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. Same smile. It's amazing.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then you see the picture of the bombed out Berlin, and that was
Yeah.
the kind of apartment she was living in.
Those were my playgrounds.
Amazing, right? Well, what an amazing story. And I'll tell you, this is a book everybody should read, A Child in Berlin. I'm going to be not only finishing it, but I'll be reading it a second time. It's a page turner. So thank you so much for being our show today. You were both so delightful.
Oh,
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much.
You're doing important work, Eli.
Yeah.
That's very kind of you to say. God
Thank you.
bless.